The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Virginia City's dusty Main Street as Matthew Harris adjusted his hat brim, studying the weathered facade of the Mountain Trust Bank. 3 weeks of careful observation had revealed the predictable patterns of the bank staff, but something about this job felt different. The towering peaks of the Comstock Range loomed behind the buildings, their snow-capped summits a stark contrast to the earthy browns of the mining town below. Inside his rented room at the Lewis boarding house, Matthew meticulously cleaned his Colt revolver while replaying the conversation he'd overheard between two miners that morning. They'd spoken in hushed, worried tones about their savings, entrusted to Mountain Trust for safekeeping until their families arrived from back east. The words gnawed at him unexpectedly, like a burr caught under a saddle. Through his window, Matthew watched as John Wright, the bank manager, locked up for the evening. Wright's expensive suit and polished boots seemed at odds with the modest salary of a small-town banker. The man's daily routine included mysterious, late-night visits to the bank, which had initially caught Matthew's attention while planning the heist. Something about Wright's furtive behavior raised questions that wouldn't leave him be. The boarding house's owner, Hannah Lewis, knocked softly before entering with a tray of coffee. Her quiet grace and kind eyes had become a comforting constant during his stay. "Another late night, Mr. Harris?" she asked, setting down the tray. Matthew noticed the worry lines around her eyes, the same ones he'd seen on many faces in town lately. The mining community was struggling, though the silver veins in the mountains supposedly ran deep. As darkness settled over Virginia City, Matthew made his way to the Saloon, where miners gathered after their shifts. The talk was all about missing payments and vanishing deposits, with suspicious glances cast toward the bank. David Young, a grizzled foreman, nursed his whiskey while describing how 3 of his men had lost their entire stakes when Mountain Trust claimed their accounts were empty. In the corner, Michael King, a cattle driver who regularly moved herds through the mountain passes, shared whispered rumors of bank troubles in other towns along his route. Matthew's practiced ear caught the pattern. Similar stories of missing money, all tied to banks that had connections to Virginia City's Mountain Trust. The web of deceit stretched farther than he'd initially suspected. The next morning, Matthew rose before dawn to watch Andrew Wright's daughter, Victoria, arrive at the bank early. Unlike her father's apparent wealth, she wore simple clothes and carried herself with genuine humility. Through his spyglass, Matthew observed her methodically checking ledgers, her face growing increasingly troubled as she worked. She clearly suspected something was amiss with the accounts. Rebecca Young, the local schoolteacher and David's wife, entered the bank just as Matthew was about to leave his observation post. She emerged minutes later, tears streaming down her face. The sight stopped Matthew cold. He'd seen that same devastated expression on countless faces after his previous robberies. But this time, it struck him differently, awakening something he'd thought long buried. The pieces began falling into place as Matthew reviewed his notes that evening. The bank's security wasn't designed to keep people out. It was meant to hide what was happening inside. The heavy shutters, the late-night visits, the armed guards who seemed more focused on watching the townspeople than potential robbers. It all pointed to something far more sinister than simple banking. Grace King, Michael's wife and the owner of the general store, provided the final piece of the puzzle when she mentioned offhandedly that Wright had been buying up failed mining claims for pennies on the dollar, the same mines whose owners had mysteriously lost their savings at Mountain Trust. Matthew realized he wasn't looking at a simple bank robbery anymore. He was staring into the heart of a carefully orchestrated scheme to steal an entire community's future. As the mountain twilight deepened into purple shadows, Matthew found himself perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the bank's rear entrance. The cool air carried the distant sounds of picks striking stone from the mines that dotted the mountainside like wounds. He'd traded his usual vantage point inside the saloon for this elevated position, watching as Wright's men moved heavy strongboxes under cover of darkness. Strongboxes that should have contained the townspeople's savings but likely held something far more valuable. The crisp autumn wind carried whispers of conversation between the guards below, their words confirming his suspicions about the mining claims. Through his binoculars, Matthew recognized John, Wright's head of security, directing the operation with military precision. The man's background as a former cavalry officer made him dangerous. He'd know how to spot surveillance and counter any attempts at interference. Victoria, the young widow who ran the boarding house where Matthew stayed, had inadvertently provided another crucial detail that morning over coffee. Her late husband's mine had been one of the first to fail after Wright arrived in town. The bank had foreclosed despite their regular payments, and within weeks, Wright's men were working the claim. Matthew had seen the same pattern repeated across a dozen properties. The sound of approaching horses drew Matthew deeper into the shadows of a granite boulder. A small convoy of wagons wound its way up the mountain road, loaded with what appeared to be mining equipment. But the careful way the drivers handled their cargo suggested something far more precious. He made mental notes of the convoy's schedule and route, information that would prove invaluable in the days ahead. Back in his room at Victoria's boarding house, Matthew spread out a map of the mining claims across his bed. Red marks indicated the properties Wright had acquired, while blue showed the remaining independent operations. The pattern was clear. Wright was systematically taking control of every profitable mine in the area, using the bank to squeeze out legitimate owners. But the operation was too large for one man to run alone. A soft knock at his door nearly caused Matthew to draw his revolver. "Mr. Matthews?" It was Hannah, Victoria's 12-year-old daughter, her voice trembling slightly. "Ma says there's trouble at the King's store. Mr. Wright's men are there." Matthew grabbed his coat, carefully folding the map into an inside pocket. Whatever Wright was planning, it was accelerating, and innocent people were getting caught in the crossfire. The scene at the general store confirmed his worst fears. Grace King stood defiantly behind her counter while 3 of Wright's men ransacked the shelves, claiming to search for stolen property. Matthew recognized the intimidation tactic. Wright was sending a message to anyone who might be asking too many questions. The look of relief on Grace's face when he entered told him he'd made the right choice in staying. As Matthew helped Grace clean up the mess left behind, she confided that Michael had discovered discrepancies in the bank's ledgers during his last delivery. Records of transactions that didn't match the amounts people had deposited. But Michael had disappeared 3 days ago on a supply run to Amarillo, and no one had heard from him since. The pieces of Wright's scheme were becoming clearer, but so were the stakes for anyone who dared to interfere. In the gathering darkness outside the store, Matthew spotted Andrew, a young miner who'd managed to keep his claim independent, hurrying through the shadows toward the outskirts of town. Following discreetly, Matthew watched as Andrew met with a small group of other claim holders in an abandoned mine shaft. Their whispered conversations carried echoes of revolution. These men were planning to take back what was rightfully theirs, with or without the law's help. Matthew knew he had to act fast. Wright's operation wasn't just about stealing money anymore. It was about controlling the entire region's wealth through its mineral resources. The bank robbery he'd planned now seemed almost quaint compared to the scale of Wright's ambitions. But Matthew had something Wright didn't: the trust of the people he'd intended to rob. As he made his way back to the boarding house, a plan began to form. One that would require him to become the very thing he'd spent years working against: a protector of other people's money. The morning light crept over the jagged peaks surrounding Virginia City as Matthew made his way to the local assay office. He'd spent years studying banking operations for his heists, but mining claims were different territory altogether. The musty office, with its shelves of dusty ledgers and geological samples, held the paper trail he needed. If Wright was systematically stealing claims, there had to be evidence in the official records. Behind the counter, Victoria, the assayer's assistant, eyed him suspiciously as he claimed to be researching potential investments. Her weathered hands moved protectively over the documents she was organizing, but Matthew noticed how her eyes darted nervously to a particular cabinet whenever Wright's name came up in their conversation. He'd seen that look before: the fear of someone holding dangerous knowledge. The sound of horses outside drew their attention. Through the grimy window, Matthew watched as Wright's men escorted a wagon laden with ore samples toward the refinery. Among them rode Michael, Wright's enforcer, whose reputation for handling claim disputes had left more than one independent miner with broken bones and crushed dreams. The sight made Matthew's jaw clench. He'd always worked alone precisely to avoid this kind of brutality. In the afternoon, Matthew found himself at Hannah's boarding house, sharing a quiet meal with Andrew and 2 other claim holders. The dining room's faded wallpaper and mismatched chairs belied the gravity of their conversation. Matthew Harris crouched behind a rocky outcrop near Virginia City, watching workers leave the First Territorial Bank through his brass spyglass. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as he made mental notes about the building's security. His well-worn leather vest concealed detailed plans of the bank's layout, but something about this job felt different. The usual thrill of planning a heist was replaced by a gnawing uncertainty that he couldn't shake. 3 days of surveillance had revealed an unusual pattern. Most of the bank's customers weren't wealthy merchants or mining companies, but weather-worn ranchers and work-calloused farmers. He'd watched Hannah Young, a widow with 3 young children, carefully deposit what looked like egg and butter money. The sight of her counting out each precious coin had stirred something in his conscience he thought long buried. The Lewis family's cattle drive had arrived yesterday, bringing 200 head to sell before winter set in. John Lewis and his daughter Rebecca had spent nearly an hour in the bank, likely depositing the proceeds that would see them through until spring. Matthew had expected to find evidence of corporate greed, but instead, he discovered a community bank serving honest working folk. The twist left him deeply unsettled. While contemplating this moral dilemma, he noticed David Wright, the bank manager, acting suspiciously after hours. The supposedly upstanding businessman was meeting with rough-looking strangers behind the livery stable, speaking in hushed tones and exchanging documents. Matthew's instincts told him something wasn't right. These weren't normal banking transactions. Using the skills that had made him a successful outlaw, Matthew followed Wright to an abandoned silver mine in the mountains overlooking town. There, he discovered ledgers showing systematic embezzlement of depositors' money, with funds being funneled to a mining operation in Amarillo run by Michael King, a notorious swindler who'd ruined several frontier banks already. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Wright had been slowly draining accounts for months, cooking the books to hide the theft. The missing money would be discovered eventually, but by then Wright and King planned to be long gone, leaving the honest folks of Virginia City destitute. The revelation transformed Matthew's mission from robbery to investigation. He spent the next week gathering evidence, carefully documenting Wright's criminal enterprise while avoiding detection. The banker's cronies patrolled the streets at night, but Matthew was far more skilled at moving unseen. He tracked their movements, recorded their meetings, and slowly built a case that would expose the entire operation. During his surveillance, Matthew crossed paths with Grace Harris, the schoolteacher who also served as the bank's bookkeeper. Her sharp mind had already noticed discrepancies in the accounts, but Wright had dismissed her concerns. Recognizing a potential ally, Matthew took a calculated risk and shared what he'd discovered. To his surprise, she didn't turn him in, but instead helped him understand the full extent of the fraud. Together, they pieced together Wright's scheme. The banker was using the stolen money to finance King's mining operation, which was really just a front for laundering the embezzled funds. Meanwhile, honest workers like Andrew Young were storing their life savings in the bank, completely unaware that their money was being systematically stolen. Victoria Lewis arrived in town leading another cattle drive, bringing news that similar bank frauds had occurred in Santa Fe and Laredo. The pattern matched King's previous operations. Find a trusted local banker, slowly drain the accounts, then disappear just before the theft was discovered. Matthew realized they were running out of time to stop Wright before he could complete the robbery and flee. Abigail Wright, the banker's wife, provided an unexpected breakthrough. Troubled by her husband's recent behavior, she confided in Grace about strange late-night meetings and mysterious correspondence. When Grace carefully revealed some of what they'd discovered, Abigail shared crucial details about the timing of the planned getaway. Matthew's skills as a bank robber proved invaluable as they worked to gather evidence. He knew exactly what documentation would prove the fraud, where incriminating papers would be hidden, and how to catch Wright in the act. The irony wasn't lost on him. A thief working to stop a theft, all to protect the very people he'd originally planned to rob. The investigation revealed that Wright had positioned himself as a pillar of the community specifically to enable his crimes. He'd joined the church board, donated to civic causes, and cultivated an image of unimpeachable respectability. The facade had allowed him to operate freely while slowly bleeding the town dry. Matthew found himself increasingly angry at the banker's betrayal of trust. A chance encounter with John Lewis's cattle drive provided the perfect cover for Matthew's continued presence in town. He signed on as a drover, using the legitimate work to explain his comings and goings while he gathered evidence. The honest labor felt strange after years of living outside the law, but he found himself enjoying the simple satisfaction of it. Rebecca Lewis proved to be an unexpected asset, her keen eye for detail helping them track the movement of money through various front companies. She'd inherited her father's head for business and quickly grasped the complexity of Wright's scheme. Matthew caught himself admiring her intelligence and determination, even as he tried to maintain professional distance. The mountain trails grew treacherous as Matthew guided his horse alongside the cattle drive, the autumn winds whipping through the passes with increasing ferocity. The herd's progress toward Virginia City slowed as they navigated the steep terrain, giving him more opportunities to observe the mining operations that dotted the mountainsides. Through his field glasses, he noted suspicious activity at several of the smaller claims. Men coming and going at odd hours, unmarked wagons departing under cover of darkness. Rebecca rode up beside him one afternoon, her mare picking its way carefully along the rocky path. "Those claims belong to shell companies," she explained quietly, pointing to several rough-hewn structures. "All registered within months of Wright taking control of the bank. The deeds trace back through a maze of paperwork, but I'm certain they're being used to launder money." Her business acumen continued to impress him, though he worried her involvement put her at risk. The cattle drive provided perfect cover for gathering intelligence, but it also presented its own challenges. Rustlers had grown bold in the territory, and John Lewis's 1,000-head herd represented a tempting target. Matthew found himself serving double duty, investigating Wright's operation while helping guard against theft. The honest work felt foreign after years of planning heists, yet he discovered an unexpected satisfaction in protecting rather than taking. During a particularly cold evening, huddled around the campfire with the other drovers, Matthew overheard talk of claim jumpers terrorizing smaller mining operations in the area. The pattern matched what he'd observed. Legitimate miners driven out through intimidation, their claims mysteriously transferring to Wright's front companies soon after. The banker's web of corruption ran deeper than simple embezzlement. Rebecca's father, John, remained unaware of their investigation, focused on delivering his herd safely to market. Matthew felt a twinge of guilt at deceiving the man who'd given him honest work, but revealing too much could put the entire Lewis family in danger. He'd seen firsthand how Wright dealt with threats to his operation. The fresh grave markers in the Virginia City Cemetery told that story clearly enough. As they pushed the herd through a narrow pass, Matthew spotted fresh horse tracks leading to one of Wright's suspected storage mines. He made an excuse to break away from the drive, following the trail to a well-hidden entrance. The sounds of activity inside confirmed his suspicions. This was no ordinary mining operation. Through a gap in the rough-hewn timbers, he glimpsed men loading heavy strongboxes onto wagons. The stolen wealth of Virginia City's families was being smuggled out under cover of legitimate mining work. Rebecca's research had revealed Wright's connection to a powerful syndicate based in Santa Fe. The stolen money wasn't simply being hoarded. It was funding a broader criminal enterprise that stretched across the territory. Matthew had planned to rob one corrupt banker, but he'd stumbled onto something far more dangerous. The simple story of right and wrong he'd first imagined had grown considerably more complex. The cattle drive was nearing Virginia City, and with it would come crucial decisions. Matthew knew he couldn't take down Wright's operation alone, but involving the law carried its own risks. The local sheriff was in Wright's pocket, and federal marshals were days away at best. Meanwhile, more families were being stripped of their life savings, their futures stolen by men hiding behind respectability and false papers. As dusk settled over the mountain passes, Matthew watched Rebecca consulting her carefully maintained ledgers by lantern light. Her dedication to exposing the truth matched his own growing determination to make things right. Together, they had assembled the pieces of Wright's scheme, but the real challenge still lay ahead. Bringing justice to Virginia City would require all their combined skills, his experience in the shadows and her knowledge of business's legitimate workings. The question was whether they could act before Wright realized the threat they posed. The cattle drive would reach town within days. Matthew touched the gun at his hip, a habit born of years living outside the law. Soon, he would need to choose: slip away with his information and leave Virginia City to its fate, or stand and fight for people who would likely still see him as nothing more than a bank robber if they knew his true past. The weight of that decision pressed heavily as he took his turn at watch, the vast mountain sky offering no easy answers. The autumn wind howled through Virginia City's narrow streets as Matthew Harris crouched behind the weathered water tower, his heart pounding against his ribs. Through his brass spyglass, he watched John Wright, the bank manager, hurriedly loading strongboxes onto a wagon in the pre-dawn darkness. Something wasn't right. The monthly payroll for the King Mining Company wasn't due for another week. Matthew had planned this heist for months, but now his instincts screamed that there was more to this situation than met the eye. Down in the shadowy street, Rebecca Young hurried past, clutching her shawl against the biting wind. Matthew recognized her as one of the local seamstresses who'd been struggling since her husband died in the mine collapse last spring. She paused at the bank's front window, pressing her palm against the glass with a look of desperation that made Matthew's chest tighten. He'd seen that same look in his sister's eyes years ago, before she lost everything to corrupt bankers back east. The pieces started falling into place as Matthew observed more townspeople gathering outside the bank, their worried faces illuminated by oil lamps. These weren't wealthy corporate types. They were hardworking miners and shopkeepers, women who'd sacrificed everything to build a life here. The strong boxes Wright was loading weren't filled with mining company gold, but the careful savings of Virginia City's common folk. David Lewis appeared from around the corner, his silver marshal's badge catching the lamplight. Matthew tensed, expecting the lawman to stop Wright's suspicious activities. Instead, David merely nodded to the bank manager and continued his patrol, deliberately looking the other way. The corruption ran deeper than Matthew had imagined. He'd come to rob from the wealthy, not steal from honest workers trying to survive. As the wagon pulled away, Matthew made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't let Wright escape with the townspeople's money. Keeping to the shadows, he followed the wagon as it wound its way up into the rocky hills toward the abandoned Silver Creek mine. The old tunnels would make a perfect hiding place for stolen funds, and perhaps other secrets that needed uncovering. Inside the mine entrance, Matthew discovered an elaborate operation. Michael King, owner of the mining company, stood directing workers as they unloaded not just Wright's wagon, but 3 others filled with strong boxes and mining equipment. Among the workers, Matthew recognized Andrew Harris, his own cousin who'd gone missing 2 months ago. Andrew's eyes were vacant, his movements mechanical, as if under some strange influence. The truth hit Matthew like a physical blow. King wasn't just stealing money. He was using the abandoned mine to hide something far more sinister. The air carried a sickly sweet smell that Matthew recognized from his time in China: opium. King was using the bank to launder money from a drug operation, while keeping the miners addicted and compliant. No wonder the town's savings were disappearing so quickly. Victoria Wright, the bank manager's wife, appeared from deeper in the mine, her fine dress incongruous against the rough tunnel walls. She carried a leather ledger that would undoubtedly contain proof of the whole scheme. Matthew's fingers itched for his revolver, but he forced himself to wait. He needed more than just guns to solve this. He needed evidence that would stand up in a proper court. Grace Harris, Matthew's sister who'd followed him west after losing everything back east, had taken a job as a clerk in the bank. She'd been sending him coded messages about discrepancies in the accounts, but neither of them had imagined the scope of King's operation. Matthew realized she was in grave danger if anyone discovered she was investigating the missing funds. Hannah Lewis, the marshal's wife and town schoolteacher, passed by Matthew's hiding spot, making him shrink deeper into the shadows. But she wasn't heading toward King's operation. Instead, she was placing small objects at strategic points around the mine entrance. With a jolt, Matthew recognized them as sticks of dynamite. It seemed he wasn't the only one who'd discovered the truth about Virginia City's corruption. Abigail King, the mining owner's daughter, appeared next to Hannah, passing her more explosives. The 2 women worked with grim efficiency, clearly having planned this for some time. Matthew remembered the rumors about Abigail's mother dying under mysterious circumstances last year. Perhaps the daughter had finally discovered the truth about her father's enterprise and decided to take action. The next few moments exploded in chaos. Hannah's first blast sealed the main tunnel, trapping King and his men inside. Matthew took advantage of the confusion to grab Victoria's ledger and help Andrew toward the exit, his cousin's drug-addled mind slowly clearing in the fresh air. More explosions followed, methodically closing off escape routes while leaving the evidence intact for the territorial authorities. Marshal David Lewis arrived with a posse of actual federal marshals, revealing that he'd been working undercover for months, building a case against King. Hannah's explosions had been the signal to move in. Matthew found himself fighting alongside the law instead of against it, helping to round up King's operation while protecting the townspeople's savings from being lost in the chaos. Grace appeared with Rebecca Young and other townswomen, all armed with rifles and determination. They'd formed their own secret society to protect their community, working in parallel with Hannah and Abigail's plan. Matthew realized that while he'd been planning his lone wolf heist, the women of Virginia City had orchestrated a far more effective takedown of the true criminals. The aftermath brought revelations that shook the town. King's opium operation had stretched across 3 territories, using the mining company as a cover. The recovered ledgers showed how he'd been systematically draining the bank accounts of workers and families, using their addiction to maintain control. But thanks to the unlikely alliance of outlaws, lawmen, and determined townspeople, Virginia City's savings were restored and its people freed from King's grip. The sun cast long shadows across Virginia City's main street as Matthew stood before the gathered townspeople, his badge gleaming, a symbol of his unexpected transformation from outlaw to temporary deputy. The mountain winds carried the scent of pine and gun smoke, remnants of the fierce battle that had finally brought down King's operation. But even as the town celebrated, Matthew knew their work wasn't finished. The deeper roots of corruption still needed to be pulled out. Hannah approached him with a weathered leather ledger, its pages filled with names and numbers that revealed an even more sinister plot. King's operation had been supplying more than just opium. He'd been selling mining claims that didn't exist, drawing innocent families from as far as Santa Fe with promises of wealth that would never materialize. The scheme had left dozens of families destitute, their life savings invested in worthless paper. In the aftermath of the shootout, Grace and Rebecca organized the townswomen into teams, combing through abandoned mining offices and hidden caches in the surrounding mountains. They discovered a network of caves where King had stored not just drugs, but forged documents and correspondence with corrupt officials stretching from Amarillo to Laredo. The scope of the deception was staggering. Matthew and Abigail spent long nights piecing together the evidence, their former antagonism forgotten in the face of shared purpose. The mining company's legitimate operations had been a mere facade, masking an empire built on false hopes and broken dreams. But it was Victoria, working quietly in the bank, who uncovered the final piece. A list of compromised lawmen who had helped maintain King's grip on power. The mountain paths became busy with riders as families began arriving to reclaim what was theirs. Matthew watched them come, their wagons loaded with tools and dreams, and felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper on his shoulders. These weren't just numbers in a ledger. They were people who had risked everything for a chance at a better life. Working with Hannah's organizational skills and David's knowledge of banking regulations, they began the painstaking process of untangling legitimate claims from fraudulent ones. The town's assay office became a hub of activity, with Andrew and Michael verifying mineral samples and claim boundaries, ensuring no one else would be deceived by false promises. The rocky terrain that had once hidden King's criminal enterprise now yielded its secrets to justice. Each day brought new discoveries, hidden caches of stolen gold, forged documents, and evidence of broader conspiracies. The Women's Protective Society, led by Grace, established patrols along the mountain trails, ensuring no remnants of King's operation could regroup and threaten their hard-won peace. As autumn approached, bringing early snow to the highest peaks, Matthew found himself standing at the edge of town, watching a new group of miners arrive. This time, they came with verified claims and honest intentions, their dreams protected by the systems of accountability that the town had built from the ashes of corruption. The bank, now under Victoria's careful management, had become a true guardian of the community's wealth. The transformation of Virginia City from a den of hidden crimes to a beacon of frontier justice hadn't come easily. Rebecca's newspaper documented the changes, telling stories of redemption and renewal that spread across the territories. But it was the quiet moments that struck Matthew most deeply. Watching families rebuild, seeing children play without fear, hearing the honest sound of pick against stone in the mountains. In the end, it wasn't the gold in the mountains that proved most valuable, but the bonds forged in adversity. The unlikely alliance of reformed outlaw, determined women, and honest townsfolk had created something stronger than any individual could have achieved alone. Matthew's original plan to rob the bank seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a deeper understanding of true wealth and community. The winter would bring new challenges, but Virginia City was ready. The network of protection extended beyond the town limits, connecting with honest lawmen in Laredo and Santa Fe, creating a web of vigilance that would make it harder for future kings to take root. The mountains that had once hidden corruption now stood as silent guardians of a different kind of treasure. The trust and determination of people working together for something greater than themselves. The autumn winds howled through Virginia City's narrow streets as Matthew Harris stood before the gathered townsfolk in the muddy square. His weathered face bore the weight of recent revelations as he explained how bank manager David Wright had been secretly funneling local families' savings into a corrupt mining operation run by Michael King. The crowd's anger was palpable, but Matthew raised his hands for silence. "I know you trusted me to protect your cattle drive profits," he said, "and I failed you by planning to rob what I thought was corporate money. But I aim to make this right." Behind him, John Lewis and Andrew Young led the shackled David Wright toward the sheriff's office. The former bank manager's pristine suit was now coated in the same red mountain dust that covered everyone else. Victoria King, Michael's wife, pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her face. "You're wrong about him," she cried out. "My husband is a good man." But the ledgers Matthew had discovered told a different story, one of systematic theft and exploitation of the mining families who'd trusted the bank with their meager savings. Rebecca Harris, Matthew's estranged sister and the town's schoolteacher, stepped forward to comfort Victoria. Though the women had been close friends, Rebecca knew the evidence was irrefutable. She'd helped Matthew decode the complex web of transactions that proved the Kings had been stealing from the community for years. The realization had shaken her faith in people, but her brother's transformation from would-be robber to defender of justice had begun to restore it. Grace Young, the local assayer's widow, clutched her young son's hand as she addressed the crowd. "Those savings were meant to help us survive the winter," she said, her voice trembling. "The cattle drive money was all we had after Andrew died in the mine collapse." Matthew met her eyes, remembering how her story had first made him question his plan to rob the bank. The thought of stealing from people like Grace had turned his stomach and set him on this new path. Up in the mountains, Hannah Lewis and Abigail Wright were leading a group of deputies toward the hidden entrance to the King's illegal mining operation. The two women had discovered the truth while tracking discrepancies in the bank's records. Their husbands' crimes had brought them together in an unlikely alliance. Now they were determined to help recover what had been stolen from their community. The sound of gunfire erupted from the mountain pass, causing the crowd to duck for cover. Michael King and his remaining men had broken out of the mine, trying to escape with what gold they could carry. Matthew quickly organized the armed townspeople into defensive positions, knowing they couldn't let the thieves slip away with the community's wealth. The cattle drive money had been hard-earned, and he was determined to see it returned. John Lewis took charge of evacuating the women and children to the safety of the church, while Matthew led a group of riders to cut off King's escape route. The autumn rain had made the mountain trails treacherous, but Matthew knew these paths well from his own days of plotting the bank heist. The irony wasn't lost on him as he used his outlaw's knowledge to serve justice. The pursuit lasted through the afternoon, with both sides exchanging fire across the rocky terrain. Matthew's group managed to force King's men toward a box canyon, but the desperate criminals showed no signs of surrendering. Victoria King appeared suddenly on horseback, trying to reach her husband, forcing Matthew to make a split-second decision between stopping her and maintaining the siege. Rebecca's voice rang out from behind him. "Let me talk to her." His sister galloped forward, knowing Victoria would listen to a friend. The two women met in the middle ground between the opposing forces, their words carried away by the wind. Minutes later, Victoria rode toward the canyon, calling out to her husband. Michael King's resolve finally broke at the sight of his wife's tears. The surrender was tense but bloodless, thanks to Victoria's intervention. As Matthew helped the deputies collect the stolen gold and documents, he found himself studying Michael King's face. The man's expression showed not just defeat, but a deep shame that Matthew recognized from his own reflection months ago. Sometimes, he realized, a man's worst enemy was the person he'd allowed himself to become. Back in Virginia City, Hannah and Grace organized the complicated process of returning funds to their rightful owners. The cattle drive money was redistributed, savings were restored, and the community began to heal. Matthew declined the offer to become deputy sheriff, knowing his past made him unsuitable for an official position. Instead, he accepted a job managing security for the honest mining operations, putting his knowledge to legitimate use. The winter proved harsh, but the town survived through cooperation and shared resources. Matthew often visited Rebecca's schoolhouse, helping to teach the children about honest work and second chances. The bank reopened under Hannah Lewis's management, with new safeguards in place. And when spring came, Matthew found himself leading the protection detail for the next cattle drive, watching over the community's wealth just as carefully as he'd once planned to steal it. As the years passed, Virginia City would remember this time as a turning point, when a would-be bank robber helped expose a greater theft, and a community learned that redemption could come from unexpected sources. Matthew Harris never fully escaped his past, but he found something more valuable than gold: a purpose worth protecting and a community worth serving. As spring melted into summer, Matthew's role protecting the mining community evolved beyond his initial expectations. The cattle drives became more organized under his guidance, with local ranchers implementing his suggested security measures. He established relay points along the mountain trails where fresh horses and supplies could be safely stored, transforming what was once a dangerous journey into a more manageable operation. Rebecca's schoolhouse flourished, becoming a symbol of the town's transformation. She and Matthew developed a deeper connection through their shared commitment to helping others, though both were careful to maintain professional boundaries given their respective positions in the community. The children particularly enjoyed Matthew's occasional lessons about tracking and survival skills, taught with a gentleness that surprised even him. Hannah Lewis's management of the bank proved revolutionary for Virginia City. She implemented a system of small business loans that helped honest miners and merchants establish themselves, breaking the cycle of dependency on larger corporate interests. Matthew often found himself consulting with her on security matters, his former outlaw perspective proving invaluable in preventing new threats to the town's prosperity. One autumn morning, word arrived from Laredo about a series of sophisticated bank robberies moving northward. Matthew recognized the pattern. It matched the methodology of his former gang. Despite his reformed status, he knew he was the only one who could anticipate their next moves. Working with Hannah, he developed a strategy to protect not just the bank, but the entire community's assets. The situation became more complex when Victoria, a young widow who'd lost her husband in the mining scandal, approached Matthew with evidence that some of the town's former corrupt officials had relocated to Amarillo and were attempting to rebuild their network of influence. The threat now came from multiple directions, testing Matthew's loyalty and resolve. During a particularly tense week, Matthew organized a network of trusted residents to maintain round-the-clock surveillance. Andrew, a former deputy who'd supported Matthew's reformation, coordinated with neighboring settlements to establish an early warning system. The mountains that had once hidden outlaws now served as vantage points for protecting the innocent. Grace, the town's telegraph operator, became crucial to their defense, maintaining constant communication with other settlements. Her quick thinking helped intercept several attempts to infiltrate the community's new financial infrastructure. Matthew found himself impressed by how the townspeople had embraced his security protocols, transforming from potential victims into active defenders of their shared prosperity. When winter approached again, Matthew faced a personal crisis. His former partner, John, arrived in Virginia City, not to rob, but seeking redemption of his own. The town watched cautiously as Matthew wrestled with his past loyalties against his new commitments. Rebecca's quiet support and Hannah's practical wisdom helped him navigate this challenge, ultimately leading to John's integration into their security network. The spring cattle drive of the following year became a testament to how far both Matthew and Virginia City had come. The operation ran smoothly, protected by a combination of reformed outlaws and honest citizens working together. The profits were distributed fairly, strengthening both the bank's reserves and the community's trust in their new systems. As summer approached, Matthew finally accepted an official position as Virginia City's security commissioner, a role created specifically to acknowledge his unique contributions. The ceremony, held in Rebecca's schoolhouse, was attended by people who'd once feared him but now trusted him with their lives and livelihoods. Hannah presented him with a new ledger, symbolically recording the beginning of another chapter in the town's history. The mountain paths that had once served as escape routes for outlaws were now marked with guard posts and supply stations, ensuring safe passage for legitimate commerce. Matthew's knowledge of these trails, once used for evading law enforcement, became instrumental in establishing a regional network of protected trade routes connecting Virginia City to Santa Fe and beyond. Looking out over the town from his favorite ridge one evening, Matthew reflected on how protecting something had proved far more satisfying than stealing ever had. The glint of sunset on the schoolhouse windows, the steady smoke from the mining operations, and the sound of cattle in the valley below all represented something he'd never found in his outlaw days: a sense of belonging and purpose that no amount of stolen gold could match.